The development of madness, or mutually assured destruction, begins in New Mexico at the detonation site for the first atomic bomb on July 16, 1945, during the Trinity test. It was only a few months later that Harry Truman made the decision to drop the bombs nicknamed Little Boy and Fat Man on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. While this brought about VJ Day and ended World War II, it also introduced the world into an era where citizens and governments had to live in the fear of entire cities being completely annihilated in an instant, a fear that manifested itself in the Cold War and almost became realized in October of 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a landmark event that brought to the forefront of the Cold War many important questions about weapons of mass destruction that are still being addressed today. Do all governments have the right to possess nuclear weapons, and what new responsibilities do these weapons add to a government's domestic and foreign policies? After World War II, the Earth quickly shifted into shades of blue and red. Communism and capitalism were the dominant world factions, and each ideology was attempting to consolidate and expand its own sphere of influence while containing the others. Thus, when Fidel Castro succeeded in overthrowing the Cuban regime and replacing it with a communist state in 1959, the United States was on edge that a country a mere 90 miles away was a cohort of the Soviets. This resulted in a disastrous attempt at counter-revolution launched by the United States, known as the Bay of Pigs, a massive failure that intensified Cuban hatred of the United States. Tension had existed since the Platt Amendment at the end of the Spanish-American War that made Cuba a military protectorate of America without Cuban consent. When Nikita Khrushchev suggested a deal to Castro in response to American missiles in Turkey, Castro was all ears. In August of 1962, the Russians began constructing missile sites, and by September, the first dismantled nuclear missiles were shipped into Cuba. On October 14th, the U-2 spy planes conducting reconnaissance work photographed these sites, and 2 days later they landed on the president's desk, beginning a gauntlet of 13 days where both sides played high-stakes poker with the fate of the world on the line. For the first few days, Kennedy attempted a guise of normality, even leaving for a brief campaign trip. Kennedy and his advisors had three options: ignore the missiles, adopt a naval quarantine against Cuba, or follow up the intelligence with a military strike on Cuba, whether with an airstrike or an invasion force. Kennedy opted for the quarantine, and on October 22nd, in an address to the citizens of the United States, informed them of the situation and the government's response. While Soviet freighters still on the water were forced to turn back, there were already operational missiles in Cuba, and in the UN halls the Soviet and American diplomats exchanged shouting matches and accusations. In 2 days, Khrushchev hardened his original deal to the United States, making America pledge not to invade Cuba and remove the naval quarantine, while also removing Jupiter missiles from Turkey, which was relatively close to the Soviet Union. Kennedy and Khrushchev warily exchanged pledges, and the world took a step back from the precipice of total destruction. However, the crisis had irreversibly affected modern politics and warfare, as it provided a precedent for governmental responsibility in handling these weapons of mass destruction. Kennedy and Khrushchev, the leaders of the two most powerful countries on the face of the earth, only narrowly avoided a nuclear war. Such a war fought with nuclear weapons could only have ended in catastrophic loss of human life and environmental catastrophes. President Kennedy stated prior to the missile crisis that, "Last month I said we weren't going to allow Soviet missiles and nuclear weapons in Cuba. Last month I should have said we don't care. But when we said we are not going to, and the Soviets go ahead with it, and then we do nothing, then I think our risks increase." What President Kennedy did not consider was the severity of tensions that existed not only between the United States and the Soviet Union, but also between the United States and Cuba. In a recently declassified document from the Joint Chief of Staff, multiple military possibilities were outlined in order to justify the U.S. invasion and occupation of Cuba in order to prevent the spread of communism and the placement of Soviet missiles at a location so close to the United States. The proposal was shocking, and fortunately Kennedy avoided further conflict for the time being. The threat of Soviet missiles was considered to be imminent because most people still believed that the Soviet Union was ahead in the arms race, and the Red Scare was as prevalent in American society as it had ever been before. On the other hand, the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev faced down similar problems with the US placement of nuclear weapons in Turkey. The threat of nuclear war loomed over both countries, and the only defense that either had was the hope that no one would fire first. Both men had an undeniable responsibility to their countries and to the rest of the world to do everything in their power to prevent a nuclear war that would lead to mutually assured destruction. There was no more than one false step between these men and the destruction of both nations. Khrushchev and Kennedy both kept things from one another in order to assert their power and influence over the other to protect their country. The new challenges posed by the possession of nuclear weapons proved to be of the utmost importance and significance throughout the Cold War, so much that Kennedy's aversion of nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis was deemed his finest hour. The rights of countries and their people to not live under the constant threat of obliteration was brought into jeopardy by the possession of these new and extremely powerful weapons, and mutually assured destruction was indeed a real threat. The responsibilities of Khrushchev and Kennedy were enormous as they shouldered the burden of millions of lives. This event in history was the closest, and is the closest to date, instance of an event where nuclear war was on the doorstep of two world powers. The responsibility of the governments was not to know when to use nuclear weapons, but to know when not to use them. Kennedy and Khrushchev learned this responsibility and the extent of their right to possess, but not use nuclear weapons as a source of both power and security. The events of the Cuban Missile Crisis establish a precedent for world governments' handling of such weapons of mass destruction. The crisis not only addressed the government's responsibility for handling such a potential disaster, but also addressed the government's right to possess a nuclear bomb. This question still remains unanswered, as recent events in North Korea and Iran, coupled with concerns over how their governments would use nuclear bombs, have people looking back to the crisis in Cuba and wondering if these nations should even be allowed to have these weapons. It was clear that at least some regulation was needed, and after the crisis, the SALT, Strategic Arms Limitation Talks Agreements, and the revamping of the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, established in 1957, played a role in defining how this great and terrible weapon should be controlled. The Cuban Missile Crisis was important in establishing governmental rights and responsibilities in relation to these missiles for future generations, and providing an example of governmental control in what could have been a nuclear annihilation. It took cool-headedness from both sides and a willingness to compromise that ultimately ended the Cuban Missile Crisis, and in this way it may relate to people on a more personal level. When arguments break out, it is each party's responsibility to be willing to negotiate and end conflicts. In some cases, it is the only way to avoid the madness that would otherwise ensue.